Well, welcome. It's just about 1 o'clock. I'm Kevin O'Brien, and I'm going to do a presentation on the fundamentals of encryption. I'm hoping that I can get through all of this. If not, I have a website. I don't know if you can read that up there. zwilnik.com is the site. And all of my slideshows are up there. Everything is Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike licensed. So you can download it, reuse it, whatever.
Ohio Linux 2015.
Okay. Also, I might as well mention, because someone asked me about it a few minutes ago, I record shows for Hacker Public Radio, and I have shows there on security as well as on LibreOffice, which are two of the things that I've been involved with. So there's a lot of material there as well. But enough of this shameless self-promotion. So, as I said, I was a little bit worried about whether I could get through everything, so I dropped a few of the initial slides that went through the history of this. If you really want to know about the history of hidden writing, which is literally what cryptography means. Kryptos is hidden, and graphein is Greek for writing. You know, you can get the whole slide deck and see it. You know, we've been doing this stuff for a long time. Julius Caesar used something called a Caesar cipher, which is, if you've ever used ROT13, that's a Caesar cipher. You know, everything gets moved the same amount. Slightly better is a substitution cipher, and you may have seen in the newspaper those kind of brain teasers to decode something. Obviously, they're not that hard. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the newspaper for everyone to do. And the reason is they are subject to statistical analysis. So you may, this was actually shown in the 9th century, so it's been known for quite a long time. So in English, we know that certain letters are more frequent than others. There are certain combinations that happen. And so in the 19th century, Frenchmen came up with something called the Visionaire Square. And this was a technique that would allow you to do a substitution where the letter substituted changed every time you did another character. And it's not bad. If it's reused, however, it can also be statistically analyzed, as was shown by Charles Babbage. And yes, it is that Charles Babbage, computer guy. So one-time pads is an application of the Visionaire Square, whereby you would have pads made up, and you take the top sheet, you'd use it to encrypt a message, and take that sheet off and throw it away. You would never reuse it again. That's actually pretty secure. But there's a problem here, which is how do you distribute this pad? So if you're going to use it among a number of different correspondents, you have to distribute a number of different copies of the same pad, and all it takes is for one of them to be looked at by an enemy, and you have no security. So this question of how you can distribute these things is really key. Now, there have also been some mechanical things, like the Captain Midnight decoder ring, which is really just another Caesar cipher. Everything is rotated the same amount. And then there's the Enigma machine. Now, we had a movie about all of that recently. Very interesting movie about Turing and the people in England trying to figure that out. Basically, the Enigma was just a really, really complicated mechanical device You would have a number of different disks. Each disk would be rotated after encrypting, after changing one letter. But a group of Polish scientists figured out how to analyze this stuff, passed it along to the British, and in Bletchley Park they set up an operation to decode these things. And what we're dealing with here is the whole question of randomness. And random is something that I think a lot of people don't entirely understand what it means to be random. It is really the key to all of this stuff. Enigma was flawed in a couple of ways. First of all, generally speaking, if it's a mechanical way of changing one letter to another, it's not random. You know, there is no way you can mechanically create randomness. And as it turns out, one of the conditions with the Enigma machine that they made use of, no letter could be encrypted as itself. You might think, well, that's not a big clue, really, but it turns out it's very important that you know that. You know, anything that gets you away from 100% pure randomness is a thread that a good cryptographer can grab and do something with. So with Bletchley Park, what you were seeing was the first application of computers to break codes. And you not only had the bomb machines that were used against the Enigma, but then a computer called Colossus that was used for the Lorenz cipher, which was actually even more secure than the Enigma machine. But along the way, they started to realize, wait a minute, if computers can break codes, can they create them? And they started to realize, yeah, that is. And so one of the things that is very important in understanding this technology is to understand that it's an arms race. So nothing is ever secure for all time. One of the things that I started hearing a few years ago was, you know, quantum computing is going to come along, and once we have quantum computing, cryptography is absolutely dead. I'm seeing people coming up with quantum encryption. All right? So the main thing is you've got to stay on top of it. Right? This stuff is always changing. But if you don't make a mistake, it is theoretically possible to create something that is going to be pretty unbreakable for some period of time. You take a look at a number of the encryption schemes in use today. NIST will typically say, we expect this to be unbreakable up through about the year 2030, based on their estimate of how fast computing technology is going to evolve. But you always want to stay on top of that. Now, key distribution is still the big problem. How do we exchange keys with each other? Right? So my friend Tom over there, I want to send him an encrypted message, and, you know, pay attention to Tom, he's a smart guy. I want to send him a message, I got to get a key. So, well, he's sitting there. I could just walk over and say, Tom, here's the key I'm going to use. Well, and that's great if we're in the same room and no one is listening in, and a few things like that. But, you know, what if Tom is at his office and I'm at my office and we're miles apart and I want to send him a message? How do we do that? Well, 3 people, Whitfield Diffie, Martin Hellman, and Ralph Merkle, solved that problem and came up with Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange. Now, you've probably heard it referred to as Diffie-Hellman. Well, Martin Hellman said, no, Ralph Merkle deserves to be there. So I'm going to go with that. And then Whitfield Diffie realized, oh, we could do something that is asymmetric. And the people who solved that problem initially, Ron Rivest, Adi Shamir, and Leonard Edelman, they figured out a way to do that. And it's based on the idea of a one-way function. And when we say one-way, what we're saying is computing it is simple and easy, but undoing it, going in the other direction, we don't say impossible, we say computationally infeasible. And you can do some calculations on this, and I've done them. And even if you are looking at Bitcoin mining rigs that can do 1 billion hashes per second, and you, well, you know, that's got to be able to do it. Well, just make your password long and complicated enough, and you can do a calculation that says, well, it would take longer than the age of the universe to crack that with present computing technology. So the RSA approach was to take a look at large prime numbers, and I'll tell you right now, I'm not going to get in any detailed mathematics. If you want to learn modular mathematics, it's interesting. I don't understand it, but it's very interesting. But there is a mathematical basis to all of this. And the idea is that you take two large prime numbers, and they should be relatively near each other, multiply them together, and get a very large number. And the reason that is computationally infeasible is discovering the prime factors of this really long number is one of those things that takes a whole lot of computing cycles. And that's why we call it computationally infeasible. The RSA procedure, what they do is multiply these together, do a little complicated math, and they create two keys. You've probably heard these referred to as the public key and the private key. Technically, it really doesn't matter which is which. It's two keys. And the idea here is that each key can decrypt what the other key encrypted. But it cannot decrypt what it itself encrypted. And that's the key. And by the way, we need to be very careful here. You notice that I'm always talking about decrypting and encrypting. If you hear someone talking about encoding and decoding, those are two different things entirely. Right? Encoding, think of Morse code. You're not hiding anything. ASCII code, you're not hiding it. Those are coding schemes. We're talking encryption. So they're two different concepts entirely. Now, the RSA is not the only one out there. Discrete logarithm, right? If you are creating a key pair in Linux, at a certain point you'll be asked, what kind of key pair do you want to create? And you'll see several choices, and one of them is RSA, we just talked about. You might see El-Gamal. El-Gamal is an application of the discrete logarithm. Then there's elliptical curve, a somewhat more recent one. With all of these, the basic idea that they all share is that they are easy to compute, computationally infeasible to uncompute. Now, the next thing you want to understand is symmetric versus asymmetric, because when we talk about key pairs, we're talking about asymmetric. You know, the key that encrypts is different from the key that decrypts. That's what makes it asymmetric. There's also symmetric, and that's when the same key encrypts and decrypts. Now, the thing that we want to understand is that actually symmetric is a whole lot more efficient. So if you're going to do any significant amount of encrypting and decrypting, you probably want to be able to do symmetric. A whole lot less CPU cycles are involved. Well, now we've got the key distribution problem. How do we distribute the key? So if you take a look at, and in the cryptography area, there are certain canonical names for all of these. It's always Alice and Bob, who are trying to talk to each other. Eve is the eavesdropper. And then, you know, Mallory is the malicious person, and so on. So you start seeing these names. That's just a little bit of cryptanalytic humor. So, public key, which is asymmetric, is where the key pair is generated, and arbitrarily one of the keys is designated as private and the other as public. Now, the thing about public is, of course, you can give the public key out to anyone. All right? My public key is printed on my web page. No reason it shouldn't be. And a lot of people smarter than me do that. You know, you go to Bruce Schneier's webpage. If you're interested in this stuff, Bruce is someone you really want to follow. And he's got a blog and a newsletter and all of that that I follow religiously. So the public key, you know, you can just hand that out. What you don't want to do is give out the private key. And I was just... It was just a story this past week about a company that made the mistake of putting their private key on a publicly accessible website where it sat for about 6 months. So, you know, this stuff can work if you don't screw up. All right? Now, there are some standards that have been used over the years. You might have heard of the Data Encryption Standard, DES. IBM developed that under a contract for the federal government. Employs several techniques. Block cipher, and what a block cipher is you have a key of a certain, let's say a 256-bit key, and you take blocks that match that and encrypt it one block at a time, rather than, say, a letter at a time. And then XOR is a mathematical technique that you can think of it various ways. Exclusive OR, if the bits are both 1 or both 0, the result is a 0, if I remember correctly. And then if one is a 0 and the other is a 1, then the result is a 1. So it's sort of like doing addition and throwing away the carry in binary. But it's an interesting technique. So, you know, what a block cipher is doing is using a technique like exclusive OR, operating on a fixed length block of bits, and then doing this some number of times, and that's the number of rounds. That can be a large number. For instance, anyone here use LastPass? I do. And LastPass, by default, does 5,000 rounds of this on your local machine, and then when you upload it to the server, they do 100,000 rounds more. So you can do a lot of these. So in cryptography, you know, we're looking at computerized stuff. So everything is binary. It's just a series of 1s and 0s. And if you do XOR, and XOR, by the way, is a reversible operation. So yeah, if they're both the same, the result is 0. And if they're different, the result is 1. And as I said, yeah, it's coding and encrypting are two different things. So here's an example. I want to send a message. The message I want to send is cat. Now, the coding scheme I'm using is ASCII. So I look up the ASCII codes for C, A, and T. Okay? Nothing hidden here at all. This is just a way of sending things using zeros and ones that the computer will understand, and your computer would receive it and turn it back into CAT. No big deal. Then I have a key, and I've decided to use as a key dog. Now, this key is the secret part, right? This is the thing that I'd have to agree. So, you know, I could go to Tom and say, I'm going to send you a message. The key is dog. So, how does XOR work? I write my message in binary, and then under it, I've got my key. And what's the result? Well, both ones, a 0. Both ones, a 0. Both zeros, a 0. And then, oh, okay, a 0 and a 1. That gives me a 1. A 1 and a 0. That gives me a 1. That's how exclusive OR works. Not terribly difficult. So. And if you XOR the result, you would get back the same message. I'll leave that as an exercise for you to prove to yourself that that is the case. So an encryption algorithm is a procedure that can incorporate any number of steps. So an encryption algorithm has to be something that is combining a number of these operations. And in cryptography, XOR is almost always a major part of all of this. Now, symmetric encryption, it has to be completely reversible. Well, XOR is completely reversible. So if I encrypted using 5,000 rounds of XOR, I can decrypt using 5,000 rounds of XOR if I know the key. If I don't know the key, I've still got a problem. And that key is the part where you really need to start thinking, okay, it's like a password, really, right? If your password is insecure, if your key is insecure, it doesn't matter how much of this other stuff you did. It's not going to get you anywhere. Now, the data encryption standard was one of the initial ones. Block size was set at 64 bits. And you will not be surprised to hear, although IBM was doing this for the government, another part of the government, a 3-letter agency, saying, could you make it a little bit weaker? And so they kind of compromised. I mean, I think the NSA was looking for 48 bits. It was like, yeah, we can decrypt that easy. They came up with basically, well, let's devote 1 bit for each byte as parity checking. And so effectively what you had was 56 bits. That was DES. Now, how long was that good for? Not terribly long, but it was an important step. So Bruce Schneier, what I said is kind of my guru about all of this, said DES did more to galvanize the field of cryptanalysis than anything else. Now there was an algorithm to study. So that was an important step. So by 1999, you could brute force DES in about 22 hours. So, not that secure. Well, let's just do more of it. Triple DES. So, the same 56-bit keys, but now there's 3 of them. So, that added enough that right now it's kind of sort of still safe. So if you see 3 DES, it's probably all right. But NIST, that's the National Institute for Standards and Technology here in the United States, they said, we need to do a little bit better. So they went for Advanced Encryption Standard, so you've probably seen ADS. And that of the things commonly available now is probably the best. There is a new standard that they just finished the competition a few months back for a new encryption standard, but it's not in widespread use and probably won't be for a little while. Now then there's Rijndael. I'm told that's the pronunciation, and it's based on the names of these people from the Netherlands. And that's the basis of AES. So the block size here is 128 bits. The key size could be any of these three, and so if you see AES 256, what you're seeing is that the key size is 256 bits. Right? The block size is still 128. And again, you do all the repeated rounds. Okay. So, all of these are symmetric. So there's a lot of XOR, and blocks, and all of that. Single shared key. Note that we have not had to talk about randomness, and entropy is the technical term for randomness. The more entropy, the more random. And you don't need it here, because the question is simply, do we agree on what the key is? Now, asymmetric gets around the key distribution problem. But to do that, you've got to have not just the one-way functions, you've got to have a pretty good amount of entropy or randomness. And I say these are the three approaches that have been used, RSA being the large prime number multiplication approach. Now, factorization, this is when we talked about the arms race. Computationally infeasible with current technology, assuming you do it properly. But this is one of those things. There was a famous example of a quote. Bill Gates, years ago, someone had asked him, you know, what do you think are some of the key problems in computing that we're going to be able to deal with? And his answer was, we need to find ways to factor large prime numbers. Well, everyone laughed because a prime number doesn't have factors. But what he was talking about was this problem, you know? Research is going on all the time with this stuff. And you know, you probably want to keep up with it if you're at all interested in security. Right. So the numbers that we're looking at are generally 1,024 digits, not too close to each other, but they should both be good sized. And then that product is used to generate other prime numbers which form the key pair. One is public, the other is private. The discrete logarithm is finding an integer that solves a logarithmic equation used in El-Gamal and in Diffie-Hellman-Merkle key exchange. And the particular numbers, that's where the entropy comes in. And if you ever see a reference to perfect forward secrecy, and I don't really have time to get into it, but it's a fascinating topic, Diffie-Hellman-Merkle is key to perfect forward secrecy. If you're paranoid, you want to take a look at perfect forward secrecy. All right. Now, elliptic curve is a new one, and it's an evolution of the discrete logarithm. You choose a curve with certain properties and then a point on that curve and then find the discrete logarithm at that point. And then the entropy comes in choosing where that point is going to be on the curve. Now there have been some issues here. National Institute for Standards and Technology recommended 15 curves as suitable. Unfortunately, NSA was involved in this process of selecting these curves. And they pushed one that even at the time people were going, why on earth did they pick that one? It's the most butt-ugly one of the bunch. So it's pretty clear that the NSA forced this process into choosing as the default a curve that is deliberately weakened. That does not mean that the approach of elliptic curve encryption is bad. It means that this particular default curve is bad. You can still use elliptic curve, and in fact, I think we should be looking at it. It is faster and more efficient than the alternatives. So it really does make sense. I think this is going to be the future of this algorithm. Now, symmetric versus asymmetric. Symmetric is fast and efficient, but needs no entropy. But it has key exchange problems. Asymmetric is resource intensive, requires randomness, but it solves the key exchange problem. Well, what can we do with that? Let's encrypt the symmetric key. All right? So, if you're using, take a simple, you're encrypting an email. You got PGP set up or GPG, whatever you like to use. They're functionally equivalent. And so I'm going to encrypt my email. What is it doing? It is generating a symmetric key that then encrypts the email. And then uses the asymmetric key to encrypt the symmetric key. And so remember, the way that works is that there are two keys in asymmetric, designated public and private. So if I want to communicate with my friend Tom over there, all I need to do is say, Tom, here's my public key. In fact, I don't give it to Tom, I'll give it to Gib, I'll give it to everybody. I've got it published on my website. Similarly, if I'm dealing with Tom, I say, Tom, tell me what your public key is, because I may want to send you something. So Tom gives me his public key. So I want to send a message. I grab his public key, create the message. It's encrypted using a symmetric key. And then that symmetric key is encrypted using Tom's public key, and I can send it to him. And then Tom says, oh, I'll use my super secret private key that nobody knows about that will decrypt all of this. But once he's decrypted the key, everything else happens using the symmetric key. So it's much more efficient that way. Now, one of the things that's wonderful about this is that we use the same technology over and over. Right? So, if you want to take a look at Ssl-Certificates, I've got a presentation on that. Maybe I'll offer that next year. It's basically doing the same thing. Only now what you're doing is you're trying to create a connection between your computer and a server out on the internet. You want a secure, encrypted connection. So what happens? Well, the server has a public key. And it offers you that public key. And then you can use that to create a secure connection through which they can then send you a symmetric key. And then they use the symmetric key for the rest of the session. So that's how that works. Take a look at Ssh Tunnels. Same thing. You use the asymmetric public-private key pair to establish a connection through which you can then send a symmetric key, and then you use the symmetric key for the balance of your session, because that's so much more efficient. So once you learn the fundamentals of this stuff, it applies everywhere. Okay? And, oh, okay, I guess I didn't have to worry about whether I'd run out of time. Questions?
I saw a slide about email. Can you go back to that? Did you have one more time?
Sure. Okay?
You mentioned something about there being a new standard that was talked about a few months ago. What were you referring to?
Ooh.
Waking me up.
That happened to do that. What was the name of that? I don't remember the name of it offhand. Probably if you went to the NIST website, you would probably get a reference to it. It was just within, last 6 months, I think.
Are there any books that you would recommend for like intros to encryption?
Are you interested in a deep dive technically into the mathematics of how to construct ciphers?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, there are textbooks on cryptography. Bruce Schneier has written one of them.
His book is a little bit out of date.
Yeah.
Understanding Cryptography is a good book.
Understanding cryptography?
Yeah, I forgot the name.
Yeah.
That's the name of the book?
Yes.
Yeah, there's actually a book of Bruce's that I like a lot more, and it's not the technical one. It's a book that he wrote called Beyond Fear, and I like it, Beyond Fear. And he wrote this in like 2003, partly as a response to 2001, 9/11, and basically saying, everyone's running around like crazy doing things that are stupid. And so he lays out a way of thinking about this stuff that I think is very good, where you start with, what's the threat you're trying to guard against? You start with that. Define the threat you care about. And then, based on that, does your countermeasure actually address that threat? Yeah. So, for instance, I apply that. I did a presentation recently on LastPass and why the LastPass hack was nothing that concerned me particularly, because they had actually done a pretty good job of doing security on their end. But I started, from the starting point is, if I use a password manager like LastPass, what is the threat I'm guarding against? And the threat I am guarding against is someone like cracking the Office of Personnel Management and getting 35 million logins. That's the kind of thing I'm worried about. And it's like, well, I'm worried about the NSA. And it's like, okay, if the NSA has targeted you, you have a different problem. And in that case, I would say study Edward Snowden the way a rabbi studies scripture. He, so far, has not screwed up.
Except his Twitter account.
Everyone gets one. Tom?
Just a comment, because you said like modular mathematics.
Yeah.
And like the Diffie-Hellman equation. There's a YouTube channel called The Art of the Problem. That's the title of the channel. It's by Britt Cruz, who's a Khan Academy contributor and content producer. Absolutely the most hands-down simplistic explanations for cryptography, how the key exchanges happen, all in plain English. And he still produces videos for Khan Academy, but his entire series of mathematics videos, which are all free on YouTube, are, I didn't understand the mod as well from reading it versus when I watched his YouTube videos. I'm like, it makes sense now. So I sat down and gone through all of them. They're really, really well done to give you a clear understanding how the key exchange works, how perfect forward secrecy works, and some of the basics of mathematics that go into this. It gives you a lot of detail with her. It's amazing. In 15 minutes, he'll have you understanding Diffie-Hellman key exchange with a few paint colors. It's really well presented, really well animated, and everything.
The Art of the Problem?
The Art of the Problem is the name of the YouTube channel. Unfortunately, he doesn't update the YouTube channel. All this stuff is not published at Khan Academy, but it's still there. He's an interesting guy if you're going to read it about him. He's a B-R-I-T, Britt Cruz. If you Google his name, it'll come up, Britt Cruz Khan Academy, and you can read, talk about some of the stuff he's working on. He's got a Kickstarter to create a whole other video series for more explaining cryptography so people can understand it.
Could you repeat the address of your website?
Z as in zebra, W, I, L, N as in Nancy, I, K.
.com?
.com.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I own the domain.
So since a lot of the problems are like sysadmins making a mistake, is there like a sort of kind of like a pilot's checklist of, you know, creating the key properly, how to secure it properly type reference? Because while they're professionals, they should do a checklist every time to make sure they're not dropping any stitches.
Yeah. I haven't thought about that. That would be interesting.
What are the odds that proving the Riemann hypothesis would end some of these cryptography techniques, particularly RSA?
I didn't quite catch all of that. What was the...
If somebody were to prove the Riemann hypothesis, what effect would that likely have on some of these encryption techniques?
I haven't the faintest idea. My guess is that, as with quantum cryptography, if it can be used to break a code, it can be used to create one. I mean, so far, if you just treat it as an arms race, that has worked to understand all of this.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments you care to share on the recent data breaches? Like it seems like every time,
Yeah.
on the news, there's been another massive data breach.
Yeah. Until heads start rolling, it will continue. You know?
And maybe after.
Well, if you start seeing CIOs doing the perp walk on their way to a federal penitentiary, CIOs will suddenly start taking this stuff seriously. I mean, the problem is, well, not just CIOs, CEOs. The problem is it costs money, it costs effort, it takes resources to do proper security. We've got a pretty good idea how to do it. It's just getting the people who control the purse strings to say, yeah, this is worth doing. All right, right now, as far as I can tell, no point-of-sale terminal in the world is remotely safe. Because it seems like every week I'm seeing another point-of-sale problem. I mean, it was just, this past week it was all the Hilton hotel properties. If you went to a restaurant at the Hilton hotels, your credit card may be bad.
On that point, I've heard there's supposed to be a new standard for point-of-sale stuff where most cards are required to have a chip.
It's actually as of Thursday. That's supposed to be the case.
And it'll just establish a one-time use token that will encrypt the transaction. So no company will ever fully store your information.
Yeah. How many people have seen all of their credit cards convert over to chip? Oh, there's a few. I checked my wallet the other day, none of mine. Sir?
How does that work online, the chip and pin? You would still have to give
That's a
them a number.
problem. And so if you take a look at Europe where they've had chip and pin for a while, what it does is it cuts down on the fraud at point of sale. It does not cut down on fraud issues online.
Although I don't think we're actually too prepared.
Sir?
Chip.
Yeah, and this is talking about new standards and encryption and going forward. There's been a lot of talk, of course, from our favorite three-letter agencies here in the U.S. about them mandating the use of backdoors into
Right.
encryption routines. And where do you see that going for U.S. trading companies?
Not well. We're just one 9/11 away from throwing away any roadblocks in the way of those three-letter agencies. Because as soon as there's an incident, it's like, oh my God, do whatever you have to do. So, yeah, I don't see that long run being very effective. So, and that's why I think what we can do is we take control of that when we do our own encryption. Because if I have chosen a good, strong encryption method and I'm communicating with Tom, who is smart enough to have a good, strong encryption method, I know I can communicate securely. And the NSA will get nothing but a blob of random noise.
And then they'll start looking at you more.
Well, then we should all do it. You know, I'm old enough to remember back in 1976, there was a bicentennial, and there was a big rally in Washington, and someone was circulating a petition about, I don't even remember what it was about now, but one of the organizers got up on stage and said, I understand some of you are concerned that if you sign this petition, you will have an FBI file. I just have one question. Why the hell don't you have an FBI file now? So I'm pretty sure I've had one for 40 years.
Or what makes you think you don't?
Well, yeah.
Any idea how far we are from the quantum computer?
Oh, they're working on it now. It's devilishly difficult because what we're seeing is, yeah, we can do quantum computing and do calculations of, we can factor 3-digit numbers with a quantum computer that's cooled to like 2 degrees above absolute zero. And it's like, okay, there's some engineering yet. The theory's there, but the engineering is going to take a while.
Another piece of that, recently a $600 million consortium was put together between MIT and 5 companies who work on that sort of thing. How you scale up something that you can do, on the head of a pen into something you can use practically in manufacture.
Yeah.
Two-part question. Do you use full system encryption? If so, how do you do it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
So, two-part question. Do you use full system encryption? And if so, how do you implement that?
That's an interesting question. Yes, I do, for some things. I think the thing about full system encryption, I'm going to go back to the Bruce Schneier approach. What is the threat that you wish to guard against? All right? If you regularly cross the border, you want to think about that. On the other hand, generally speaking, you can be legally compelled to decrypt when you cross the border, or they may not let you cross the border. There's a lot of issues there. And you have to think about, you know, is this the hill I want to die on? Now, as to how to do it, if you're using Linux, you're probably still safe with TrueCrypt. It has been forked. VeraCrypt is being actively developed. If you were on Windows, the TrueCrypt driver, Windows driver, they ran into some problems there. So you could basically get a privilege escalation out of it. That's considered bad. But, you know, if you're not using Windows and, you know, if you're using Windows and you're concerned about security, I have to question. Yes?
What about BitLocker for Windows?
When I worked for the state of Michigan, I was required to use it. You are trusting your security to encryption that you don't know anything about. And that's, if you can't look at the code, you don't know. And we just saw that with Volkswagen. You know, none of that would have happened if the code was open. So to me, the takeaway is open code makes us all safer. Okay, I guess we're probably about done. Thanks, everyone.